I'm glad to talk to you today about Introduction to Islam. We're going to be talking about some of the things that are, I think, very basic, things that you might already know, things that you would learn in a basic middle school introduction to religions class. But because of the group here today and because of our experience, so we're going to be talking about some interesting stuff as well. I think that maybe some of you here might be very experienced with Islam, so we might go over some of the basic stuff very quickly. But today we're going to talk about what Muslims believe, and we will briefly, I think, talk about why some Muslims are violent and others are nice. We may not have a lot of time to talk about that, but Cynthia will be able to definitely clarify anything that I'm not able to cover here. So mostly we're going to focus on what Muslims believe. Now, first of all, in looking at this, why should we do this at all? Okay, and Jesus says, and this is actually from the Old Testament as well, it says that we should love God with all our mind, heart, soul, and strength. And today we are going to be loving God with our mind. Loving God with our mind is something that is underappreciated, I think, in our culture. We sometimes even can discourage people who are wanting to love. There's many ways to love God with your mind. It even can be something like studying for a profession so that you can be a member of the community who loves God and is growing God's kingdom in that way. Today, I think of this as we're learning about other religions so that we can engage with these people, so that we can meet them in the way that they think about the world and tell them about God's love. So thank you all for being willing to love God with your mind today. So this is the very basic thing that you'll hear sometimes. They talk about the 5 pillars of Islam. And the first one is the creed, the shahada. Now this is something, it basically is, there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet. Now, in order for this to really count, you need to say it in Arabic. Arabic has a privileged status in their religion. And I have seen that this is something that to be a Muslim, you have to say this at least once in your life. Some Muslims can be kind of superstitious about it, and if you say it once, then you're good. You know, you're a Muslim, and you just need to maybe do some of the other stuff, but you're on your way. And so I've had this sort of encounter with people where they say, okay, just say these words and repeat after me in Arabic. You know, they try to get you to say it. But this is their creed. The next one is prayer. Prayer is a big deal for them. Prayer should be a big deal for Christians, but we don't have it in quite the same structured way that they do. Muslims are supposed to pray 5 times a day. And when they do pray, they have a very specific way of doing it where they bow to the ground. If sometimes they'll have a prayer mat or something like that, which they may bring, or they may even be going to the mosque several times a day. I'm sure many Muslims go all 5 times a day to the mosque. And when they do it, it's important that they bow, put their head on the ground in submission, and pray toward Mecca. And so there's a specific 5 times a day when they're supposed to do it, and this is something they take very seriously. And that's why when you go to airports and things in other countries, even in Europe, there's prayer rooms and everything. To Muslims, it's a very big deal. Fasting, so Saum, this is mainly during the month of Ramadan. They can fast at other times, but it's mandatory to fast during the month of Ramadan. Now, during the month of Ramadan, it's not that they literally don't eat all month, but they are not allowed to eat during the daylight hours. The month of Ramadan, it doesn't line up necessarily strictly with any of our months. They are on a lunar calendar. So for those of you who are familiar with the differences between the lunar and solar calendar, there's some variation, and that's why Ramadan is not always the same month as we think of it. Alms is also encouraged. That's called zakat. And then the pilgrimage is a very big one. at least once in your lifetime, to be a good Muslim, you really need to go to Mecca. And so you will have Muslims from all over the world going to Mecca. If you ever go to that part of the world, if you're in Saudi Arabia, you will often see that there's people from lots of different places. And many of them are doing the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. Now, if you want to be super spiritual, you can do that more, but everyone is supposed to do it at least once in their lifetime.
Excuse me?
Yes?
Can that be done any time of the year, or is there a special?
My understanding is that it can be done any time of the year. And as I should say also, I'm surrounded by a group of people who may know a lot more about this than I do. So if I answer a question incorrectly, please let me know. But I think that's right. So we're going to talk quickly about 6 things that Muslims believe. They do believe in one creator God. Islam is a monotheistic religion, which they share in common with us and Judaism. They also believe in prophets. Prophets are very important to them. And in fact, they will make a point of this if you talk to them. They will talk about Prophet Abraham especially. He's very revered. Prophet Moses, someone like that. And they see Jesus as a prophet. Now, of course, as Christians, we see Jesus as a prophet, but more than a prophet. But to them, he is a prophet. He's an important prophet. They will even say things like, I love Jesus so much, therefore I'm a Muslim. But of course, for us, he's much more than that. But they do believe in the prophets, and we could talk all about that if you have any questions. Holy books, they have holy books. Basically, we're going to talk about the Quran and some of these other things, but they do have holy books. They don't necessarily believe in a lot of our holy books. They will, in fact, often strongly criticize. This is a complicated topic, but theoretically, they're supposed to accept our holy books, but they don't. It's kind of a paradox. It's a contradiction. We can talk about it if you want to. But they actually think that there were other books that were lost, and the ones we have are corrupted. That's kind of the short version. They believe in angels. They believe in demons. In fact, the whole tradition about genies is basically like, Arabian Nights demons. It's their version of demons. So they believe in that sort of thing. If you want a good, interesting discussion, I like asking Muslims about jinns because they have all sorts. Jinn is the word for genie. That's a good conversation topic. They believe in extreme fate. They're very fatalistic, like the Greek version of the ladies with the, cutting people's threads. Extreme fate. They think everything is going to happen the way it's going to happen, and there's nothing anyone can do about it. They do believe in a judgment day, and they actually believe that Jesus will return, although they have a different version of that than we do. Some other quick ones here. They believe that we have one life, so it's not like Hinduism where you're reincarnating or something like that. You die and then you're judged. They do have an emphasis on morality, personal responsibility. They believe in eternity. They believe in a paradise, a very sensual kind of paradise where you get to live out all your fantasies. And they also believe in hell. And they do believe in Satan. Some it may surprise you, but there are some religions that believe in Satan and he's not a bad guy. But in Islam, Satan exists and he is a bad guy. And they believe in demons. So one of the things about this, and some of these were selected because they are in some ways very similar to Christian beliefs. There's a lot of overlap. It's very different than talking with certain religions where you just don't even know what the foundation is sometimes, where you can find points of agreement. When you're talking with Muslims, there's a lot of things that you can talk to them about, that you can build bridges. It's good to, first of all, whenever you're talking to anyone from any background, it's really good to have some common things, you're always trying to find a commonality, a starting point where you can say, hey, we're not so different, we can talk. And with Islam, there are a number of things that are very similar, and so we want to use that to begin discussions. These are things we can use to relate. So we did talk about how they think Jesus will come to judge the world. So as an example, they believe that Jesus will come to judge the world, but in their view, he breaks the crosses. Crosses are seen as a sign of idolatry. You shall have no symbols. That's something that we don't really talk about in this one very much, but symbols are haram in Islam. Haram is a word for bad. Symbols are generally not good, so or any like image. This goes back to the Deuteronomy thing, you shall not make a graven image. They see crosses as an image. Now it doesn't really make any sense, but that's what they think. So, or it's a symbol of idolatry at the very least. So let's talk about a couple of these things. The meaning of Islam literally means submission. So this is kind of an interesting thing to have your religion named. And so Muslims would be people who are in submission to God. Not a terrible concept in and of itself. Of course, Christians have the idea that we're servants of God. But this can be, I think it's a bit more aggressive, and it can take on a certain meaning, especially when you look at some of the violent passages that we're going to look at later. The Quran is really the holy book of Islam. And it's very important to them. Any Muslim will believe anything in the Quran. That's not really debated. There's some other things we're going to talk about where there's disagreement between Muslims, but any Muslim will believe the Quran. It's parts of the Quran are definitely based on the Bible, on the Torah, on the Old Testament. So if you were to read it, you will find things which sound very, very similar. And then there's other things which are completely different. And actually, one of the things that's interesting about it is that a lot of the things that are similar, they sound similar, but they're different in a very significant way. Some of the meanings change. So, like, they have the Garden of Eden, but Adam is 6 feet tall or something like that. Very like kind of weird stuff. Or sorry. 9 feet tall, something outrageous. 6 feet's normal, I guess. So Muhammad is a revered prophet. Yeah.
You're saying all Muslims believe the Quran. So a Sufi Muslim who's more mystical, he would believe it just like a Sunni would?
They will all believe in the Quran. I'm not sure about different interpretations. They may have different interpretations, but generally speaking, the Quran is seen as very authoritative. And actually, this is a good time to go talk about, we're going to talk about the Hadith as something that's maybe not authoritative, but first let's do this Muhammad thing. So Muhammad is, of course, the revered prophet. He's seen as the most important prophet of Islam. And historically, there's the whole story of, how in the 6th, 7th century, he was a prophet who was learning things from traveling Jewish and Christian people. The various messages had made it to him, and he basically synthesized this into his own version. That's the way we see it. And although some people do deny that Muhammad even existed. So it's not simple. But to Muslims, he is a very important person. And in fact, they're not even really allowed to say his name, or depending on how strict you are, they will often say, Muhammad, peace be upon him. They put that at the end as sort of as an extreme reverence. And so, if you say anything bad about Muhammad, you may be able to say certain things about Islam even, but if you say anything bad about Muhammad, that could really get you in trouble. So I guess be careful about that. The Hadith, so there's let's talk about the hadith and commentaries. So we talked about the Quran as being the authoritative holy book of Islam, but there are also other writings, which they have many, many other writings. Actually, let me just real quick. So this is not even all of them, but a lot of writings. You can see some of these are hadith, and these are basically from sources, people who supposedly knew Muhammad. They're writing down other things. As far as this is when he said this, kind of collecting some of the sayings. And then the commentaries are kind of explaining what some of the parts in the Quran mean. And I mean, of course, we have commentaries as Christians. Nothing wrong with commentaries. But the point about these is that in Muslim thought, they are not the Quran. And so although a lot of stuff about Islam, like, my understanding is that things like the hijab and burqa, a lot of these things about their daily practice in life come from the hadiths. So they absolutely respect and revere the hadiths. But at the same time, if you are in a discussion with someone, they will very often quickly say, oh, that's just from a hadith. And the hadith also have different rankings. Some are more revered than others. And something that's not like the most highly revered hadith, someone will very quickly say, "Oh, we don't respect that." And there's even such a thing as Quran-only Islam. So people who are really trying to just go back to the Quran, because actually, to be honest with you guys, if you read a lot of the stuff in the hadiths, there is wild stuff going on. There's demons talking to people, Muhammad wanting to kill himself because he's got a demon in him, and they don't like talking about that. So it's a very, if you really get into this stuff, there's a lot to learn, and it's very, very interesting. There are different sects in Islam. I don't really know a lot about some of the differences, but of course the main ones are Sunni and Shia. And this has to do with a dispute very early on in their religion. And so, yeah. So moving on, so we talked about some of the similarities with Christianity. There's also some big differences. God's character is very different in Islam. God is not really very loving in Islam. That's one of the big things. And there is something good about God being, the judging father, but you're not going to see anything like the parable of the prodigal son, for example, in Islam. So it's a very sort of different concept. We're going to talk a little bit about the theology of the Big Four. Salvation is different. Lots of different lifestyle things, and then the way that they treat women is different. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about the women thing, but I think that is going to be talked about in a later section. So if you're really talking to Muslims a lot about religion, these are things which will come up, and it is good to know about them. I'm probably not going to be able to completely go into explanation on every one of them, but suffice it to say, they're going to have objections about the Trinity, because they like we said before, they're monotheistic and they deny that Jesus is God. They have no interest in that, and they say God would not have a son. And when they think about this, they get it's very much talking about like biology. They get very worked up on the biology of it. And of course, as Christians, it's not really so much about Jesus being the biological Son of God. It's about Jesus being the Son of God as his representative, as the Messiah, as the Son of Man from Daniel 7. But a lot of times they're just thinking about, sex and that nasty stuff. They get really worked up about God would not have to use the bathroom. They'll say stuff like, I'm sorry if that's like a bit crude, but this is like the sort of thing that they will say. They also do not like the idea of Jesus dying on the cross. They believe that Jesus did not die on the cross. They've got a very complicated view where he was taken away. He was stolen. he was taken from the cross and something else was put in his place. And very like a magician. Everyone thought that Jesus died, but he didn't. And I kind of see this as a childish thing about they don't believe that God would allow his prophet to be killed. But if you read the Bible, a lot of the prophets were killed. It's not even just about Jesus. So we are strongly in the tradition of like this is something that very often happened to prophets. They will also talk about the reliability of the Bible. As we talked about before, they kind of believe that there were people like King David and this sort of thing. Of course, they believe in Jesus, but they don't believe in a lot of the documents. Now, why do they do that? Because the documents, first of all, when Muhammad was going around preaching, they didn't have these documents. It was very easy for Muhammad to say, oh yeah, just look at the teachings from the Torah and it will confirm me. I'm the final prophet. But then they got access to these books and they found, hey, actually it doesn't confirm Muhammad in any way. And even today they're trying to find ways to read Muhammad into the Bible. That's a very common theme.
So
Yeah.
They object, they say the angel has been changed. Do they say the Torah has been changed as much?
They strongly they do object to the Torah. Now it's very contradictory. In my opinion, their view is very contradictory. They will be glad to insult the Torah. They will be glad to say things bad about the prophets. They'll complain about Ezekiel. Absolutely, they do. They're cutting off the limb that they're standing on. In certain contexts, they want to say that, oh yes, we have the tradition going back all the way. But in other contexts, they will completely insult everything that we have in the Bible. So it's, like I say, it's somewhat contradictory. Now, regarding the peaceful or violent discussion, most Muslims do live peacefully with their neighbors. And of course, that's great. And you will often hear verses like, there is no compulsion in religion. And this is from the Quran. Right there, you've got the reference. So that's a good thing. However, there is something that a lot of Western people don't understand that really changes this. And it's a very important concept called the doctrine of abrogation. And the way to understand it is that not like when we read the Bible, and maybe we do this even to a fault, but we take it very literally as this, okay, this is a command for all time. Sometimes we will apply nuance to that, but we don't generally think that God is he's telling us one day to do X, and then the next day he's coming in and telling us to do Y, or something completely different, something that would completely, okay, you shall not murder. And then the next day, okay, murder's fine. We don't expect that sort of thing. But abrogation basically is the idea that later revelations can replace earlier ones. So the way of thinking about it is, yeah, okay, there's contradictions in the Quran, but when you see a contradiction, you go with the later one. If he tells you one thing on the first day and then on the second day he tells you something completely different, go with what he told you on the second day. And theoretically, this cancels up to 2/3 of the Quran. So a lot of the early stuff is no longer relevant. Now, historically speaking, early in his ministry, he was very peaceful. He was a part of a small group. But then later that he came into power, and when he came into power, it was the way that he dealt with those around him was very different. And in fact, of course, we know from the history that there was a lot of conquering by the sword, both during the time of Muhammad and, for centuries and arguably still today. So this is really the thing that it's very different than the Christian way of thinking about, the scriptures. They will say that, okay, that is in the Quran, but it's abrogated. So they have a lot of wiggle room, a lot of wiggle room on some of these issues. So, for example, in Medina, when we're talking about some of the later, less peaceful verses, you've got fight and slay the pagans wherever you find them. And there's the reference for that one. So at some point, and there's quite a few more verses. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head, but there are other verses. And people do use these verses to argue for jihad. So I think that ultimately our position, and there are debates about this, by the way, but our position is that the authentic Islamic tradition is actually, we do agree with some of these, let's say, extreme personalities or people. We think that probably is the correct way to understand the Quran, is that it does encourage jihad, that really devout Muslims who study this, if they are sincere, they will follow jihad. Obviously, we don't encourage that, but we think that is the logical outcome of their position. So once you understand all of that, you may experience an aha moment. So this is a question which comes up a lot. You'll hear this, in secular discussions as well. You could hear this on Piers Morgan or something. Can we have a reformation in Islam? Because you look at the Christian history, and the Reformation was such a good and powerful force in our history for removing some of the excesses, removing some of the problems, the ways people had misused the Bible for their own purposes. And so the idea of having a reformation in Islam, that's very appealing to a lot of people. And the unfortunate reality is that we do not think a reformation in Islam will work. And the reason is because in the Reformation in Christianity, it was people ignoring all of the structure, all of the power structures, all of the traditions, some of the very damaging traditions which are not biblical, and going back to the original Bible. Sola Scriptura, we're just going to go back to the Bible. What did Jesus really say? Was Jesus really encouraging indulgences and these sorts of things? But unfortunately, if they were to do this, it would lead them more towards jihad. So this is the problem that modern Muslims find themselves in. A lot of them see the problems with the very violent version. And so typically, rather than trying to reform and become, more Muslim, those people will become more secular. And there's a very big movement in Islam to become atheist, secular. Also, certainly Christians. We have so many Muslim background believers who are Christians, and honestly, many of them have received dreams from our Lord Jesus. Some of the most amazing things that are happening in the world are happening with our Lord speaking to Muslims. But outside of that, the Muslims who do not like Islam typically will become secular. So thank you everyone for your time. We have a couple minutes for questions, and then I think after that I'll hand it off to the next speaker. So yeah, thanks. I hope you all got something out of that.
I got a question.
Yeah.
Back into Jesus on the cross.
Yeah.
What is the purpose that Allah put someone on the cross that take away Jesus?
Yeah.
And put someone else that look like him? What is the purpose, the meaning for the Muslim?
Yeah.
Believe in this?
I have a question.
Can they continue of sacrifice?
Yeah, sir.
Does Islam teach continuing of blood sacrifice? How
Right.
the Old Testament.
Right, I understand. Yeah, so just for the people online here who may not have heard that, so we received a question from the room about the concept of Jesus on the cross. What's the purpose behind that? What's the Muslim thinking about that? And I think that is such a good point, and actually it's one of the big problems with Islam that we will often point out, is that it doesn't really make sense. Why would they put Jesus on the cross and then replace him? And actually, the whole act of doing this swap, it deceived a whole bunch of people. Now, they do have a verse which says Allah is the greatest of deceivers, but this is a big problem for them. Why would Allah want to deceive Christians? So like us, we're Christians, we're deceived. We think that Jesus actually died. Why did he do that? Did he want there to be, all these billions of Christians who would be, in conflict with Muslims for thousands of years? Why would, and he's going to send us to hell because we actually saw Jesus die and think that he actually died? Why? There is not really a good, I've never seen anyway, someone try to really give a good answer to this. The reality of the situation is that the death of Jesus is historically attested. It's something that both in the Gospels, but also in other sources like Tacitus, you have the death of Jesus is a fact of history, and the Quran says that he didn't die. Why does the Quran say that he didn't die? In my opinion, it's probably, like I said before, because they don't think that God would allow their prophet to die. So I think that's about as far as the thinking goes on it. If someone else has heard differently, I mean, I'm sure people have tried to come up with other explanations, but I don't think there's much more to it than that. So there was a question from online. Did you want to ask?
Yeah, how do they reconcile the writings of the disciple who spent 3 years with him, writing down what he said and what he did, with Muhammad's concept of who Jesus was, written hundreds of years later? There's a big discrepancy.
Yeah. So certainly the Quran, and I may have missed part of that, but the Quran was written much later, sorry, you were saying much later than the Gospels? Is that kind of the main thing?
Yeah, the writers who wrote the Gospels spent 3 years with Jesus Christ, working with him,
Right.
writing with him, learning from him. Muhammad wrote about him hundreds of years later.
Yeah.
There's a credibility issue there.
Right, yeah, that's right. So Muhammad himself certainly had no personal experience of our Lord Jesus, and yet he writes about him through what he heard presumably from caravan people. There's also a big issue with, they can talk about the reliability of the Bible, but there is a big issue with the Quran, because there was a historical event where they gathered up all the copies they didn't like and burnt them. So there's kind of a crazy. If you want to look this up, this is from Uthman. Uthman went and collected all the variations, and so this is why sometimes they'll say, oh well, there's only one version of the Quran, which is not true, by the way. There are several versions of the Quran. But for the most part, it is true that for the most part they use only one, and there are not a lot of variations. But the reason there are not a lot of variations is, like I said, this is a well-known historical fact. It's not controversial that this happened, and it really makes you wonder about what other versions were there that were out there. You just don't know.
When did he burn them?
I don't remember that. I can get you that answer briefly, but yeah.
Any other prophets in Islam after Muhammad?
No. And in fact, he's seen as the ultimate prophet. Something we didn't talk about. We kind of skipped over the Sunnah stuff, but I think this would be a good time to talk about it. So for a lot of these people, it's not only is he like the greatest prophet, it's that it almost gets lifted to a crazy level. So, for example, like as Christians, yeah, we want to be like Jesus. We even say, what would Jesus do? We try to emulate Jesus as much as possible. But there's limits, and they don't have these limits. So for them, it's like, well, I need to grow a beard because Muhammad had a beard, right? And we see that as so silly, but that's totally true. And if Muhammad were left-handed, then they would have trained everyone to be left-handed. It's and it gets almost to a perverse level. There's stuff about sex, how he did it, so how we need to do it. There's stuff about using the bathroom, how Muhammad used the bathroom. In fact, there's so a lot of our moderns, I don't want to get into it too much, but using the bathroom was a bit different in the ancient world, and they hold on to a lot of that stuff as something, well, that's how Muhammad did it. And, frankly, I'm surprised that there aren't more of them riding camels to work because, he was on camels. So, but it's a weird thing for us. We kind of see how that's like almost a type of legalism where it's not so much about the meaning, it's more about the ritual or the vesture. And in the same way, they think that the Quran was written in Arabic in heaven, and it's I guess Arabic is the heavenly language, even though we know that it's not from linguistic study. But yeah, there's a lot of these weird things like that. So.
But they believe he died.
They do believe Muhammad died.
Because you were talking about prophets from that.
Right.
The main number one prophet.
Right. Yeah, but I think in their defense, I think they would say the prophets aren't allowed to be killed, right? So they may die of... Although that's not... Actually, no, you're right, though. But he died... Right, he died from an enemy. So why was he allowed to die? He was poisoned to death by... kind of a funny story, actually. He captured a city and killed this woman's whole family, and then had her prepare a meal for him, and she poisoned it, and he died after much pain and suffering. So
He was killed by a woman?
yeah. Yeah.
Is that
Yeah.
why they have this issue with misogyny? Yeah.
I don't know. I couldn't say. Yeah.
Still not enough, get enough how to respond to Muslim that Allah take Jesus down
Yeah.
and put someone. And in the Quran, chapter 35, I think, verse 18, they say no bearer of burden will bear the burden of another. So what is the purpose of Allah or Islam put someone else on the cross? Don't this
Right.
listen to
Yeah.
picture of Quran 35 verse 18?
Yeah, good point. So first of all, and let me explain to the online audience this interesting comment here. So there is a verse in the Quran which talks about no one bearing the burden for another. Now, usually when this verse comes up, they're talking against Jesus dying on the cross for us. They say, oh, no one can pay the penalty for someone else. It says so in the Quran. But in this case, our questioner from the audience is saying, hey, how can they say that then Allah put someone else on the cross in Jesus' place? Wouldn't this be one person dying for another? And, I think that's an interesting comment. I'm not sure how they would respond to that, but it's certainly an interesting idea. In certain contexts, that may be a thing to bring up. Now, one uncertainty, and I'm not sure about this, it may be that they think Allah did not put an actual person in Jesus' place, but that he made like an illusion so that there wasn't anyone who was actually dying. I think that might be how they would respond, but I'm not sure exactly how they think about that. But part of the reason this is such a big deal is because there is a verse in the Quran which says, It's very emphatic, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it's like, he did not die. No, he did not die. He didn't die on the cross. It's something like that. And so they've got this problem where there are a lot of Muslims who feel like they have to defend that verse, even though it's completely against all of history. But you do have some Muslims who are like, yeah, maybe that's not right after all. But for sure, the majority opinion is, Jesus did not die on the cross. That's what it says. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thanks everyone for your time. I really appreciate it. It was a pleasure to give this talk for you, and I'm sure you'll be learning a lot more about this stuff as we go into some of the next talks. So, thanks.